My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, I'm not going to give you a whole big introduction on the text that we're looking at. Normally, I start out by spewing a bunch of biographical, historical information at you. Today, I'm just going to start and read it first in Chinese and then in English. I know I don't normally read in Chinese, but I think you'll understand why I'm going to do this after I explain to you what I'm actually reading. Here is one of the poems we're looking at today. 清晨，公鸡呜呜叫，大声说着早上好。农场动物起得早，美味早餐吃个饱。Here's the English. Early morning, the rooster, oh, crows. In a loud voice, he says, "Good morning." The farm animals wake up, delicious breakfast they eat until full. Did you hear the rhythm and rhyme in that original passage? Each line of the poem ends with a word that rhymes with ao. And did you hear the structure? That structure is so common in traditional Chinese poetry. It's called a 七言绝句, a 7-syllable heptasyllabic line. I mentioned this last time in the podcast on Huang Zunxian. Each poem has a couplet where the first line in the couplet complements the second line in the couplet. So in this poem, line 2 completes what happens in line 1. So the rooster wakes up in line 1 and crows. What is he crowing about? We're told about that in line 2. So there's this structure in lines 1 and 2. Something happens in 1 and we're told about what it is in line 2. Line 4 completes what happens in line 3. In line 3, the farm animals all wake up. In line 4, they are eating breakfast. This is all very typical in terms of Chinese poetry. If you were to read Tang Dynasty poetry, this would look very familiar. This is pretty much the same form as Tang Dynasty poetry. I'm guessing you already realized this, but we are not reading Tang poetry. What era is this from? Let's take a look at another poem. 棚里传来摸摸声，是谁住在里面呢？透过小洞看一看。In the shed issues forth the sound of moo moo. Who is it who lives inside? Take a look through the barn door and have a glance. This is a 3-line poem, but it's pretty much that same structure. Each line has this 4-3 structure, so it's a heptasyllabic poem that's divided into the first part of the line has 4 characters, the last part of the line has 3 characters. Very standard, very standard. If you were to look at Li Bai, Du Fu, you would see these kinds of poems all over the place. This is not Li Bai. This is not Du Fu. Have you figured it out yet? This is not a formal book of poetry. Nope. What I am reading to you is actually a children's book. It's a flip book where you have these pictures of life on the farm and you flip little things over and it will reveal something. I'll try and find it online and put a link in the podcast on the webpage. In fact, one listener has actually asked me to put more URL links on the webpage if I discuss a book, so I'm going to try and do that more. This book is fascinating, and I wanted to do a podcast on it because I think a lot of times we forget that Chinese literature has this long hold over China, much more so than I would say anything comparable in the West or really anywhere else in the world. I'm less certain of that statement in terms of India, but I think most places outside of China, you really don't have the long hold that Tang poetry, that Song poetry has over China today. How did I get this book? So I have kids. A close friend of mine and friend of the podcast, Brandon Foltz, actually donated this book to me when he was moving. It was his child's book, and he was like, I can't take it with me when I move. So he gave me a bunch of Chinese books. The book is just called Nongchang. That's just farm. What I find so fascinating about this is that this book, it was not originally a Chinese children's book. In fact, it's a British book called Peep Inside the Farm, published in 2015 by Usborne Publishing. and then it was translated into Chinese in 2018. So think about this. This is not a book that was originally written in Chinese. That would make sense if this rhyme was originally written in Chinese and they structured it in kind of a Tang Dynasty poetry style. But that's not what happened. This is a children's book that was originally written in English and translated into Chinese. So when they translated it, they went out of their way to translate it from English into these ancient poetic patterns that have been with us for more than a millennia. Now, I have to admit, these poems frequently break with that ancient poetic form. So you will have the writing in this children's books. It's sometimes written in this poetic form, which I mentioned is the heptasyllabic form, the 七言绝句. And then all of a sudden it will break from that form. So it's not like when the translators translated this book from English into Chinese, they translated everything into that poetic form. But I still do find it incredible that this English children's book is being translated into Chinese using these ancient poetic forms. Let's look at another poem. This one is written in a very simplistic 3-syllable or 3字 per line form that was used to teach children the Confucian classics, particularly in the Sanzi Jing, the 3-character classic. 挤牛奶要准时，早一次，晚一次. If you are going to milk a cow, you have to do it on a schedule, once in the morning and once in the evening. How about another one in that style? But this one's going to be a little bit longer, and in the middle, it's going to break that poetic form just a bit. 拖拉机轰隆响，松松土，播种忙，小种子要长大，需要阳光和水。小麦苗快快将成熟后磨成面粉烤面包，拖拉机本领强。So the tractor, it makes a loud noise. It softens up the ground and busily casts the seeds. Little seeds, they will grow big. They need sunlight and water. The wheat seedlings grow up fast. After you ripen, you will be ground up into flour and baked into bread. The tractor, it is strong. I'm not going to bang on this too much longer. The main point I had in bringing all this up is I've done a lot of podcasts on poems. I've talked about the structure of these poems occasionally. That's something that I think a lot of translations don't capture. I know to English readers, when you're reading these translations, it can sometimes seem like something that's not all that important. What I want to say is that in Chinese poetry, it is important. These poetic forms still play a major role in how Chinese people hear their world. When they translate stuff, even a silly children's book about being on the farm, they translate it into these forms. If you want to understand what China means to Chinese people, what forms of Chineseness keep popping up again and again throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, what forms of being Chinese continue to be important to the Chinese people, it is these poetic forms. At least that's one thing that's incredibly important to Chinese people. It's important enough that Chinese folks will translate a children's book from English into these forms. These forms create patterns, and that is how they hear the world. These patterns are the grooves along which Chinese folks are inclined to think, just as in English we're inclined to think in terms of rhyme. Somehow, if you say something in the form of a rhyme, it makes it more true. You can say the dumbest thing in the world, but if you say it in rhyme, it will seem less dumb. That is all just another way of saying culture, literature, these things, they never let go of us. It's incredibly difficult to escape the gravity of culture. It pulls us in constantly. Culture and literature, they are there with us. They cut grooves in our souls when we are young. They are hard for us to break out of as we age. Today, I'm not going to end on a Chengyu. Rather, I'm going to end with the beginning of one of the greatest works of Chinese children's literature. It's in that same style of those last poems that I covered. I mentioned it. It's the 3-syllable classic, the Sanzi Jing. In pre-modern China, this was a poem that most kids started to memorize as they were studying the Confucian classics. This was the gateway drug to Confucianism, essentially. Here it is. 认知出性本善, 性相近, 习相远. In people's beginnings, their nature was good. People's essence is close to this, but it is by custom or practice that they get farther away from this. This formulation is one of the things that most kids in pre-modern China would have memorized as their first Confucian classic. My first Confucianism, sort of a Fisher-Price version of Confucianism. Okay, that's it. I'm going to leave it here. It's a shorter episode. If you have any thoughts on this, please send me an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support me financially, show me some love on Patreon. I'm Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.